The death of my husband was a devastating blow. We had shared a lifetime together, and now without him, the house felt strangely empty even though my son still lived with me. He was 40 years old, had never worked but had always been a good boy. Since he was a child, he had shown a special affection towards us, and now after the loss, he seemed more concerned about me than ever. Every morning when I woke up, he was already in the kitchen preparing my breakfast. It was comforting to know I wasn't alone, although lately something strange had started to happen. My body felt weaker every day, my energy drained quickly, and there were days when I could barely get out of bed. My son assured me he would take care of everything, that I had nothing to worry about. I often watched him as he cooked, his movements meticulous, almost as if he were following a ritual. He would bring my meals to bed with a calm smile, and although I tried to hide my concern, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One evening, while he was preparing dinner, I decided to talk to him about what was happening. "Son, I've noticed that I've been feeling more tired than usual lately. Have you noticed anything strange about me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He looked up from the pan and stared at me with concern. "Mom, you're getting older. It's normal to feel this way. But don't worry, I'm here to take care of you. You don't have to do anything, just rest," he replied, his voice soft, almost hypnotic. His words comforted me, but they couldn't entirely erase the unease that had settled in my chest. Dinner was delicious as always, and I felt a bit better after eating. However, that night I struggled to sleep. My mind was filled with thoughts, and my concern continued to grow inside me. The next day, the weakness was even worse. I could barely get out of bed, and my son had to help me dress. I felt frustrated by my inability, but he didn't seem bothered at all. In fact, his attention was almost excessive, as if he didn't want me to lift a finger. "Mom, please rest. I'll bring you breakfast," he said with a reassuring smile. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling. Something inside me kept telling me that something was off, but I couldn't identify what it was. My son returned with a tray full of food, sat beside me, and began to feed me, his gaze fixed on mine. "I want you to get better, Mom. I'll do everything in my power to take care of you," he whispered, and for a moment, his look seemed strange, as if there was something more behind his words. As the days passed, my condition didn't improve. I started to notice small changes around the house that made me feel uncomfortable. The house, which had once been a warm and cozy refuge, now felt cold and oppressive. The curtains were always closed, and sunlight barely entered. I realized we hardly received visitors anymore, and my friends had stopped coming to see me. One day, while he was busy in the kitchen, I gathered the courage to get up and explore the house. I walked down the hallway carefully, trying not to make noise. I reached my husband's room and slowly opened the door. The room was exactly as he had left it, but there was a sense of abandonment in the air. I sat in his chair and let the memories wash over me for a moment. I felt a lump in my throat, and tears started to roll down my cheeks. I didn't understand why I felt so weak, so disconnected from the life I once had. I decided to return to my room before my son noticed my absence. As I passed by the hallway mirror, I saw my reflection and barely recognized myself. My face was pale with deep circles under my eyes, and my eyes looked lifeless. That night, while he helped me to bed, I asked if there was any way to see a doctor. "Son, I think I need to see someone. A doctor, maybe someone who can tell me what's happening to me," I said, my voice trembling. He leaned in and kissed my forehead, stroking my hair. "Mom, I've already told you, you don't need to see anyone. You just need to rest and let me take care of you. Trust me, everything will be fine," he responded with a calmness that unsettled me. Despite his words, my unease didn't disappear. That night, I had confusing dreams full of shadows and whispers I couldn't understand. I woke up several times, sweating and with my heart racing. I felt that something was out of my control, something I couldn't explain. Weeks passed and my health didn't improve. Each day, I felt weaker, and my attempts to talk to my son about my concerns were always met with the same reassuring response. I began to feel trapped in my own house, surrounded by a mystery I couldn't unravel. One morning, while he was in the kitchen, I decided to try to go out to the garden. I needed to feel the fresh air on my face to see the sunlight. I got up slowly and walked to the back door. When I opened it, I felt a rush of cold air that made me shiver. I stepped out into the garden and closed my eyes, letting the sun warm my skin. It was then that I heard him behind me. "Mom, what are you doing out here? You should be resting," he said with a tone that tried to be understanding but had an undertone of disapproval. "I just needed a bit of fresh air," I replied, turning to look at him. He approached and gently took my arm, guiding me back into the house. "You know I'm doing this for your good. I don't want anything to happen to you," he said, his voice almost a whisper. I felt frustrated but didn't have the strength to argue. I let him guide me back inside and sat on the sofa, feeling my energy drain once again. The weeks continued to pass and my health didn't improve. One day my son came to my room with a different expression on his face, something I hadn't seen in him for a long time. "Mom, I've met someone," he said with a shy smile. "It's a girl I met online. We've been talking a lot and I think it's time to meet her in person. I'm going to visit her for a few days." The news surprised me but also gave me renewed hope. Maybe this trip could bring some joy and normalcy to our lives. "That sounds wonderful, son. I'm happy for you. Enjoy yourself and don't worry about me. I'll be fine," I replied, trying to sound as enthusiastic as possible. He left the next day and surprisingly, I started to feel better almost immediately. My energy, which had been so low, began to return. I could get out of bed without help and even ventured to take some walks in the garden. It was during one of these walks that I received a visit from an old friend. I hadn't seen her since my husband's funeral, and her arrival brought relief but also concern. We sat in the living room, and as she observed me closely, her eyes filled with worry. "You look better, but I'm still concerned about you," she said, her voice firm and sincere. "There's something I need to tell you, but I need you to listen without interrupting." I nodded, feeling a knot in my stomach. "I've been thinking about what you told me about your weakness, and how you feel better when your son isn't here. I can't help but think he might be poisoning you." The accusation hit me like a bucket of cold water. I felt a surge of indignation and anger rise within me. "That's crazy. How can you even suggest such a thing?" I shouted, feeling my face redden. "He's my son. He would never do something so horrible." My friend remained calm, but her gaze was still hard. "I just want to make sure you're safe. Please don't be angry with me for worrying about you." Rage took over me completely. How could she doubt my own son? I jumped up, trembling with fury. "Get out of my house. I don't want to see you again," I shouted, pointing to the door. She looked at me for a moment longer, sadness and pity in her eyes, before leaving silently. I felt our bond break at that moment, but my anger was so intense that I didn't care. I stood in the living room, trembling, trying to calm down. When my son returned a few days later, the first thing he did was head to the kitchen. I was there trying to prepare a simple soup, something I hadn't done in a long time. Seeing me, his expression changed to one of surprise and concern. "Mom, what are you doing? You shouldn't be cooking. Let me take care of everything," he said, almost snatching the spoon from my hands. I looked at him intently, remembering my friend's words. Everything seemed so strange, and a small part of me began to wonder if she was right. But I dismissed those thoughts immediately. My son couldn't possibly be capable of something so monstrous. "I just wanted to do something for myself, son. I've been feeling better these days and thought I could try cooking a bit," I replied with a forced smile. He didn't seem convinced but didn't insist further. Instead, he took control of the kitchen and made me sit at the table. As I watched him move with such natural ease, a feeling of doubt started to creep into my mind. Everything was very strange. What if my friend was right? What if my husband's death hadn't been as natural as it seemed? That night I couldn't sleep. The thoughts kept spinning in my head over and over again. My son had always been so good to me, so attentive. But now that attention seemed suspicious, loaded with a hidden purpose that I couldn't comprehend. My friend's words resonated in my mind, mingling with my own doubts and fears. I didn't know whom to trust or what to think. The security of my home had crumbled, and now every gesture from my son, every word, filled me with unease. I had to find a way to uncover the truth, but I didn't know where to start. Things quickly worsened after my son's return. My health began to deteriorate again. I felt trapped in an endless cycle of weakness and despair. Every time I tried to mention the possibility of going to the hospital, he found an excuse to dissuade me. "You don't need a hospital, Mom. I'm here to take care of you," he would say, his voice loaded with a strange calm and determination. But something in his eyes made me doubt his sincerity. The days grew longer and my body grew more fragile. One day, taking advantage of a moment when my son was busy in the kitchen, I took the phone and dialed emergency services. "I need an ambulance, please. I'm very sick and need to go to the hospital," I said, trying to keep my voice from betraying my desperation. The ambulance arrived within minutes, its lights flashing in the twilight. My son came out to the garden, his face showing deep anger. "What are you doing? Why did you call an ambulance?" he asked, his voice full of tension. "I can't go on like this, son. I need medical help," I responded, trying to stay calm. The paramedics quickly came in and, after a brief examination, decided that I needed to be taken to the hospital immediately. My son tried to protest, but his nervousness was evident. Upon arriving at the hospital, they took me to the emergency room, where several doctors began running tests on me. After what seemed like an eternity, a doctor approached me with a serious expression. "Ma'am, we've found traces of poison in your system. You are being slowly poisoned," he said with a gravity that made me shiver. The doctor's words were a brutal blow. Tears began to roll down my cheeks as my mind tried to process what I was hearing. There was only one person who was constantly close to me. "It must be my son," I said through sobs. The doctor nodded and took note of my statement. Within hours, the police arrived at the hospital. My son was detained and taken in for questioning. His face showed disbelief. "I didn't do anything. I can't believe you think that of me," he shouted as they took him away, his words echoing down the hospital corridor. I was left alone in the room, surrounded by doctors and nurses. The reality of the situation hit me with overwhelming force. I felt a deep sadness, a pain I couldn't understand. I spent several days in the hospital while I recovered. One morning, the same friend who had suggested the terrible possibility that my son was poisoning me appeared at the door of my room. Her eyes showed concern. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted this to happen, but I had to tell you what I thought," she said, her voice full of sincerity. I looked at her for a moment, feeling a wave of uncontrollable emotions. Finally, I nodded, inviting her in. "I can't deny that your words helped me see the truth. Thank you for being brave," I said with a sigh of resignation. She approached and hugged me tightly, and in that moment, I knew I had regained a priceless friendship. We spent the following days talking about everything that had happened, trying to understand how we had reached this point. She promised to take care of me during my recovery, and her presence was a balm for my wounded soul. Finally, the day came to return home. The house that had been a place of pain and doubt now felt a bit safer with my friend by my side. I settled in the living room, trying to find some peace amid the chaos. Meanwhile, my son was in jail, fervently denying that he had poisoned me. The visits were tense and filled with unanswered questions. Every time I saw him, his eyes pleaded for understanding. "Mom, I didn't do it. I would never hurt you," he would say, his voice loaded with desperation. But the evidence was clear, and distrust had sown an insurmountable barrier between us. My heart, though broken, knew I had to protect myself. Days passed slowly as I tried to rebuild my life. My friend was by my side every step of the way, helping me regain my strength and confidence. The house began to feel a bit warmer, and although the pain of betrayal remained, my friend's company gave me new hope. Despite everything he had done, I couldn't help but visit him in jail. He was my son, and although the pain and betrayal tore me apart inside, I needed to see him, needed answers. The visits were tough, with a physical and emotional barrier between us that seemed insurmountable. But one day something changed in his gaze, and he said he needed to tell me the truth. We sat in the visitation room, the gray, cold walls increasing my sense of anguish. My son looked at me with tear-filled eyes and began to speak. "Mom, I did all that because I wanted to spend more time with you. I never wanted to kill you. I just wanted to take care of you and have you at home with me. It wasn't about the inheritance or anything material. I just wanted us to be together," he said, his voice breaking with each word. I stared at him, trying to understand. The confession left me breathless, overwhelmed with a tangle of emotions. "How could you do this to me?" I asked, feeling the tears start to flow down my cheeks. "How could you think that poisoning me was the way to keep me close?" He grabbed his head with his hands, desperate. "I don't know, Mom. I was so scared of losing you, of being left alone. I thought that if you were sick, you wouldn't have to leave the house and I could always be with you. Please forgive me. Withdraw the complaint, and we'll be happy together again. I promise." His words pierced my heart. The idea that my own son had done something so terrible for such a twisted and wrong reason filled me with pain. But still, he was my son. How could I abandon him completely? I returned home with my mind in turmoil. My friend was there waiting for me with a cup of hot tea and a worried look. "How did it go?" she asked with a softness that made me break down. I told her everything my son had confessed, every word, every tear. She listened in silence, and when I finished, she took my hands in hers. "You can't forgive him for this. Not after what he's done. He was poisoning you, he was killing you slowly. No matter what his reasons were, that cannot be justified," she said with a firmness that I couldn't ignore. I knew she was right. Every fiber of my being told me I had to stay strong. But the motherly voice inside me kept screaming that I had to protect my son, give him another chance. But he's my son. How can I leave him like this? How can I live with that? I responded, my voice broken by internal conflict. She looked at me with sadness and compassion. "I know. It's a difficult decision. But you have to think about yourself, about your well-being. If you let him free, how can you be sure he won't do it again? You need to protect yourself." I spent the night awake, struggling with my thoughts. The love I felt for my son clashed with the reality of his actions, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw his pleading face, his tears. Finally, I made a decision. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I had to do it. The next day, I went to the police station and withdrew the complaint. I felt relief but also fear, knowing that I was taking a great risk, but also hoping that this time things would be different. I returned home and told my friend what I had done. She disagreed but understood my decision. "I hope you're making the right choice. I just want you to be safe," she said, hugging me tightly. When my son was released, I knew our relationship would never be the same, but there was still a chance to rebuild something. Seeing him cross the door of our house, I knew I had to set boundaries and conditions to protect myself and our relationship. "We'll have to go to therapy together, and I need you to understand that what you did was very wrong. I can't just forget what happened," I said with the firmest voice I could muster. He nodded, his eyes full of remorse. "I'll do whatever it takes to show you I can change, Mom. Just give me a chance." We began attending family therapy sessions. It was a long and painful process, full of difficult moments and uncomfortable revelations. But little by little, we began to heal. My friend was by my side at every step, offering her support and unconditional friendship. It had been almost a month since my son had returned home. The situation seemed to have improved significantly. He no longer offered to make meals, and his behavior was exemplary. Family therapy had had a positive impact, and I began to feel that our relationship was healing. Each day, his presence was more comforting, and I started to trust him again. One afternoon, after being in the bathroom, I headed to the kitchen to make myself some tea. As I brought the cup to my lips, I felt a sharp pain in my abdomen. It was unlike anything I had ever felt before, a sensation of impending death that overtook me. The pain intensified quickly, and I doubled over the table, barely able to hold the cup. Amid my suffering, I heard my son's voice, a voice that this time lacked its usual warmth. I'm so sorry, Mom. I need the money to go live with that girl. You and Dad are a burden. The words embedded in my mind like daggers. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How had it come to this? I barely had the strength to speak but knew I had to do something. The door burst open, and my friend appeared in the doorway, her expression full of concern. I tried to scream but the pain prevented me. Still, I managed to muster the strength to articulate a few words. Help! He poisoned me. I managed to say, my voice breaking. My friend didn't waste any time. She took out her phone and without my son noticing, ran to her car to call an ambulance. From the window, I could see her gesturing frantically while talking on the phone, hiding from my son's view. He, realizing what was happening, tried to stop her, but it was too late. The sound of the ambulance siren was heard in the distance, approaching quickly. The police arrived shortly after, forcefully entering the house. My son was detained, struggling and shouting that he hadn't done anything while I was taken on a stretcher to the ambulance. The pain was unbearable, but I knew I was safe, at least for the moment. The look of anger and despair on my son's face was the last thing I saw before the ambulance doors closed. At the hospital, the doctors worked quickly to stabilize me. Tests confirmed what I already feared. I had been poisoned again. I felt a deep sadness and a bitter sense of betrayal as I lay in the hospital bed, thinking about everything that had happened. My friend arrived shortly after, her face full of concern and relief at seeing me conscious. You're safe now. I can't believe he tried to do it again, she said, holding my hand firmly. Tears started to flow down my cheeks. I felt broken inside, unable to understand how my own son could have done something like this to me. The reality of his betrayal was too hard to accept. I don't understand how we got to this point. I thought we had overcome the worst, I said, my voice barely a whisper. He's a monster and you must make sure he never has the opportunity to harm you again, my friend responded, her tone firm and determined. Her words echoed in my mind in the following days. As I recovered in the hospital, I thought about everything that had happened, the decisions I had made, and the consequences of giving my son a second chance. Days in the hospital turned into weeks. Each day my friend was there, making sure I was never alone. The recovery process was slow and painful, not just physically but emotionally as well. Finally, I was discharged and could return home. The place that had once been my refuge now felt like a constant reminder of my son's betrayal. My friend moved in temporarily to ensure I was safe and accompanied at all times. One afternoon, while we were having tea in the living room, I decided to address the issue I had been avoiding. I don't know what to do now. How am I supposed to move forward after all this? I asked, my gaze lost in the teacup. My friend looked at me with compassion and determination. You have to move forward. You can't let what he's done destroy you. You're strong and deserve to live in peace. You need to focus on your recovery and surround yourself with people who love and support you. Her words gave me strength. I knew she was right. I had to rebuild my life piece by piece and learn to live without the constant fear that had dominated my days. The police confirmed that my son would remain in prison for a long time, and although that reality was painful, it was also a relief to know he couldn't harm me anymore. Some time had passed since my son's last attempt to poison me. Life, though difficult, had stabilized a bit. However, there was one last thing I needed to do before I could close this painful chapter of my life. I needed to see him one last time in prison. The journey to the prison was a trip of silence and reflection. My friend, always by my side, accompanied me to the entrance, but I knew I had to face this alone. Upon arriving at the visitation room, I felt a knot in my stomach. The gray walls and the severe faces of the guards created an atmosphere of oppression that was hard to bear. When my son entered, I saw him through the glass that separated us. He looked thinner and more tired. As he sat in front of me, our eyes met, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. "Mom, thank you for coming," he said, his voice trembling. "I needed to see you one last time," I replied, trying to remain calm. There was a long silence between us. Words seemed insufficient to describe the magnitude of what had happened. Finally, he broke the silence. "I know what I did is unforgivable. I'm so sorry, more than you can imagine. I was desperate, confused. His voice faded, and tears began to roll down his cheeks. I felt a pang of pain seeing him like this. A part of me wanted to forgive him, wanted to believe he could change, that there was still hope for him. But I knew I couldn't continue ignoring the reality of his actions. I can't forgive you this time. I tried, I really did, but you failed me in a way I can't forget. Because of you, I've lost your father and almost lost my own life, I said, my voice firm despite the pain. He sobbed, gently hitting the glass with his hand. Please, Mom. I don't want to spend the rest of my life here. I promise I'll change, that I'll be a better person. Just give me another chance. Tears filled my eyes, but I knew I had to stay strong. I can't, son. I can't let you endanger my life again. I have to think about my own safety now. I can't live with that constant fear anymore. The desperation on his face was devastating, but I knew I couldn't yield. I had made a decision and had to stay firm for my own good. When I left the visitation room, I felt exhausted but also relieved. I knew I had done the right thing, even though it broke my heart. My friend was waiting outside, and seeing me, she enveloped me in a comforting embrace. You've been very brave. I'm proud of you, she said with a warmth that deeply comforted me. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions. My son's trial proceeded quickly, and the evidence presented was overwhelming. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison for the murder of his father and the attempted murder against me. His fate was sealed, and I had to move forward. The pain of knowing I would never see my son free again was immense. However, I knew I had to find a way to live with it, to accept reality and move forward with my life. My friend was by my side every step of the way, offering her support and unconditional love.